Welcome to this episode of Breaking Badness, recorded on March 10th, 2025. This is our DNS Masterclass episode because DNS is the internet's backbone and battleground. So we want to talk about its past, its present, and its future. And we've also noticed we talk about DNS, our listeners, meaning everybody that's listening today, really seems to resonate with it. So we wanted to dedicate an entire episode to talking about DNS. Why not?
Oops, nothing but DNS.
Oops, all DNS.
To clarify, since this is a masterclass, we're going to invite guests up on stage with us, and they are going to resolve IP addresses, and then we're going to coach them on how they did it.
Yes.
Okay, to set expectations.
So we should probably start at the beginning. That's always a very good place to start, according to the Sound of Music. But would either of you like to kick off like the origins of DNS? How did we start?
Well, first the earth cooled.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah,
then the dinosaurs came. Then there were host files.
And the dinosaurs used DNS.
It became apparent in the early development of what became the internet as we know it today that a couple of things were true. One of them was that people are generally not great at memorizing different IP addresses and many different IP addresses that correspond to resources that they might want to get to. And also that the hosts files, which used to be the way that was done, and there still are host files on modern computers buried way down there, and sometimes people still edit them and use them. Things were growing to a point where managing the individual host files, which is a text file that has the resolutions of the domain to the IP address, that was becoming very unwieldy. And so there had to be a better way.
There's gotta be a better way.
And some smart people came up with one. I don't know, Tate, you want to carry the ball a little further here?
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is rooted out of academia, right? So the early stages of distributed computing and networking were heavily influenced by the different university systems trying to talk to each other. But eventually there was a large enough need for kind of a distributed way to do these lookups that folks got together in 1983 and initially put out the first set of RFCs out of, I think it's Southern California. This is Macapitras. So the very first RFCs around DNS were born then in 83. They get structured again in 86. We're like, really, to get to where we are now, we need to start like jumping to 99 and beyond, because that's where the internet things become commercialized. The registrar space and becomes much larger than the kind of education and government and military space that it had been prior to that. And really the need for giant, robust reverse phone books of where things were needed. We'll stop there.
What would you say like we talk about 1999 and beyond with commercialization, Taylor, but like before that commercialization,
Sure.
Were there attacks? Were DNS attacks prevalent at all? Or is that more of a contemporary concept?
I think it depends on what you define as an attack in DNS, right? Does something leverage DNS to transmit something bad? Or I'm sure that stuff went on.
Or does somebody abuse the protocol itself? And by the way, that's as we go through this discussion, and whenever we think about DNS in the framework of InfoSec, it's important to make that distinction that there are attacks on DNS and abuses of the protocol itself, like DNS tunneling and hijacking and stuff like that. And there are conventional attacks of everything you can think of, from phishing to ransomware, et cetera, that use DNS objects, domains, IP addresses as part of that attack chain. So throughout today, we'll probably distinguish between those.
Okay. As this is the master class.
But yeah, I'm trying to think back. If we're going way back, like we've all, or at least Tay and I, but I think maybe you have, Kali, read The Cuckoo's Egg. And I don't think that there was any DNS shenanigans specifically in that attack or set of infiltrations, shall we say, incursions. That wasn't part of how the fellow in Germany ultimately got into the networks that he was getting into. But yeah, I think it goes back. It's so many things on the internet where so many of the protocols that we rely on today were originally devised not with security in mind, but with efficacy in mind. And DNS was a very elegant solution to the problem of managing these host to IP translations at a big scale and with robustness and what do I want to say, redundancy and resilience and probably other words that start with R that that make it work so well. But of course, like so many of the bedrock protocols, it lent itself to various kinds of abuse, which are, when we think about cache poisoning and hijacking and stuff like that, those were figured out probably, as Taylor was saying, around, they started to get more common around the dawn of the commercial internet, maybe distinguished from like the research and defense internet than academic.
Would you say, like, in terms of how certain protocols are created too, would you say we've gotten to a point where security is thought of first instead of efficacy, or do you think efficacy still reigns supreme?
Tay, you talked about this in an article, I don't know, like last year sometime, maybe last fall sometime. That would have been fall of 2024 for people who are listening to this, who knows when in the future, about what was that system that was like super compartmentalized modular system that was designed absolutely from the bottom with security as the intention. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yes, that's the DARPA projects.
Yeah, back to
You know
DARPA.
what?
Everything old is new again.
Really interesting too is people loved that episode too. Like that, it was DNS and DARPA in that particular episode. So yeah.
It's like chocolate and peanut butter.
They're listening for the word DARPA. No, I think, are we more secure than we were? In some ways, for sure, especially if you consider like the early 2000s, where just a lot of stuff was being transmitted in plain text on the wire and very easy to like sit down at a Starbucks Wi-Fi and see all the people just yeeting their contact details into the stream. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways we've gotten better, but our surface area is much larger, right? So we've got more people online, and more of our lives are online, and more of the essential things and services that we utilize on a day in and day out basis are online. So yeah, like you could get better at security, but then if you increase your chances for a security event like 100-fold or 1,000-fold or 10,000-fold, you can still run into issues.
And I think it's an interesting question, Kali, because when you think about, your question has to do with, have we learned to design protocols more securely than we used to? Have those lessons filtered down into what we're doing today? And I think there's a lot of evidence that yes, that is happening. But you also have to keep in mind that so much of what happens as far as internet maliciousness and badness is happening more at the content layer of things almost. So it's a phishing email is not abusing any protocol except for social engineering, social interaction type protocols, but not technical protocols. And one of the things I say a lot of the time about how we look at the world is that the bad things that happen across the internet, by and large, are happening on permitted connections. They are connections that in retrospect, you wouldn't have wanted to permit if you had realized they were bad from the get-go. But when it's a permitted connection, that means it's not likely that there is an abuse of the protocol. And now we find out all the time there are 0 days that are discovered in various implementations of various things. There was a pretty interesting one in Bluetooth that came out a couple days ago. And that's worth investigating. Maybe even it's something we do on a future episode. But there is so much, Taylor, you put it well, like there's so much attack surface that's available that doesn't require you to burn a 0 day or craft some kind of abuse of a protocol or anything like that. You metaphorically, you get people to open doors and you walk through those doors instead of fire hatcheting through them.
Do you think it's still valid though to look at this when we say content is more of the preferred method and violating like social engineering? Like we don't see too many stories on attacks against DNS, but it's still valid to look at it as a
yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. And back to what we talked about at the top, which is there are DNS objects used in practically every attack that if you're looking at the DBER or other reports on threats and whatnot, which I think we'll talk about a little bit today, DNS objects are throughout those. So DNS is involved, absolutely, and it has role to play in attack and defense and everything. But to the very specific question of, are we designing protocols more securely? I think in many ways, yes, and that's not stopping the rate of problems that we're seeing by and large in the world, I guess, is the point I'm making.
Okay.
DNS also has a little surface area of the content side as well, right? So like host names that get selected are fishy names are fishy for a reason. There's a reason why there are so many homoglyphs targeting banks and Apple and what have you. DNS is that intermingling of culture and technology. It's on a global scale. So what happens broader in the culture also exists in DNS to a degree, right? Like it just has to on some level to support it because so much of our lives are online.
Every domain has a job to do, and some of those jobs are to fool humans into clicking things. One of the things I think is amusing, at the risk of helping bad guys improve their tradecraft, which it's a small risk, and I don't think a lot of bad guys listen to our show. We're a wholesome show for good people.
Come on,
but it amuses me when I see a subdomain that has a typo or homoglyph in it, because in subdomain space, you can create anything you want. Like you control all of that. Why would you put a typo in there when you can spell Microsoft the right way?
I wonder if there is like some of it's automated, some of it's some weird Darwinian self-selection of the folks that are most likely to miss the typo are also most likely to give you their contact details after.
That's a real thing for sure.
Well, we started talking about a little bit about how DNS works. Can we get into that a little further? So we talked about how DNS translates a domain name from an IP address, but can we go into it a little bit further? Because like I said, this is the masterclass. So if people aren't familiar with it.
Absolutely. We're resolved to make everybody smarter about DNS on this show.
Yeah. So from a DNS perspective, there's a lot of things that it can be used for. It's this kind of globally distributed, the first distributed ledger. And the only useful one. No, but when we think of DNS, you think of like the records that go into DNS, the domain name system, which are, let's do our top 6 records. And we'll go.
That's right.
We can go down in reverse order. Right?
This is the Billboard chart of DNS records.
Yeah, I'll go and then you go. How about that?
Sure.
Okay. I think you have to start with a name server record. Your NS record is lets you list the authoritative servers for your domain. So when you own a domain, you say, hey, these are my name servers. And the name servers say, hey, if you want to find the content for Taylor's boring website, it's over on this IP address or this set of IP addresses or whatnot. So I'm going to go name server. So it tells you go find the record. The name servers are where you go ask.
Yep.
Yeah.
And a name server record is like a special flavor of an A record. And the A record is probably the thing that people tend to think of in general when they think of DNS. So the A record says this host name, which is typically we think of as a domain, example.com, could be a something.example.com. But anyway, it resolves to this IP address. And sometimes there's more than one IP address so that you can see multiple A records. If you do NS lookups for domains and spend some time spelunking around, especially for like big companies and whatnot, you'll often see quite a set of A records that go with even just the bare domain name, the Apex domain. That's my next record to talk about in the Hall of Fame is the A record.
And so we've got the name servers that are pointing to the A record. They can also point to quad A records. I'm going to,
yes.
But I'll go name servers just briefly are really interesting from like, it's where if someone registers a domain, they're making choices around the name servers. Now, for most folks, it's going to be like whatever the registrar tells them to do, like whatever your default for GoDaddy is, or for Squarespace or whatnot. But from the adversary side of the house, that can be your first glimpse of, oh, they're doing something odd with this domain. They're going to manage their own name servers and very tightly control visibility into what questions are asked and answered about the domain that they own, that type of thing. So name servers.
And it gives them telemetry, which is important for them sometimes too, that where they can see exactly what IP addresses are coming in and asking for resolutions on their very specialized malicious name server.
Oh yeah. So yeah, but then quad A records are just IPv6 It's like, hey, there's 4 times the address space. What do we call these? They're quad A.
Except it's not 4 times the address. It's like a bazillion times the address. But yeah. I guess they decided that they wouldn't name the record the proportional number of A's that represents the difference between V6 and it would be too many. Yeah. And by the way, as an aside, I think there's an important point to make here where this is it can be a point of confusion when people are talking about this generally. People throw around the word DNS server, but there are really 2 fundamental kinds of things that both get called DNS servers, right? Taylor was talking about authoritative name servers. That's the server that has the authoritative answer for what's the resolution for this domain. But there are resolvers, and that's the server that you first go and talk to and ask the question of, hey, go get me example.com. And then it moves up the chain. Ultimately, that goes to the authoritative server, and we could get into details like how caching works and whatnot. But when people talk about, I'm going to set up my DNS servers, they're usually talking about what the resolvers are that they're going to as the first step in getting the domain names. And so most people, statistically, when they have a DNS server, that's what they're thinking about. Most people in the world aren't actually managing authoritative name servers, but everybody who registers a domain and intends to do something with it has to pay attention to what those authoritative name servers are and then decide how they're going to use it.
But they could run resolvers. Everybody could run those if they want.
Correct.
Nothing's stopping you.
I could run if I want.
Yeah, absolutely. Get out there. It's a question.
The pie hole is a really interesting one, but that's probably a whole episode.
Oh, yeah.
I want to make a joke here about shutting.
Everybody does. That's fine. We're all making it.
I'm just like, it feels mean. I shouldn't do it. But it's low hanging fruit. I shouldn't do that. So how does passive DNS play into this?
So passive DNS is just observing the DNS queries, right? Looking at NS lookups or the A answers that come down the pipe for those, or looking at MX records or TXTs or whatnot. The passive DNS is more the collection of DNS queries out in the wild, of which there's a number of ways and spots that you could do that at. But yeah, in general, you're looking at questions and answers that are being asked on the traffic of DNS that you can see.
Okay, cool. So moving forward from how DNS works to, we talked a little bit about early DNS attacks or lack thereof, but about other vulnerabilities surrounding DNS that we could share with our audience in this masterclass.
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Dan Kaminsky.
Who saved the internet one day.
So again, that's one where we could probably spend an entire episode talking about it. Maybe we should actually.
This could be, when we say masterclass, we don't have to end with just one class.
Yeah, I think it's tough to really fit everything we really want to talk about in 45 minutes. But it essentially, DNS was designed very early on and it scaled very well. But as the internet scaled, the things that we put in place to keep up with it opened us up to malicious attacks on the domain name system itself that folks had not. Who knows? Again, it's one of these things where you don't know if anyone was exploiting something before you discovered it. It's tricky to tell. But Dan Kaminsky was a researcher and went to DEF CON and published research on how DNS was vulnerable to cache poisoning, and that you could eventually rewrite other people's answers for them. So when you think that you're asking for your bank, instead of your bank, you're getting me, Tim and I, we put it together a website for you.
It looks a lot like your bank.
It looks just like it. So yeah, that I think we'd definitely be remiss if we didn't at least talk about that. I think that when we think about how DNS has scaled over the years to meet the need, again, from the 80s, where the number of folks that were online were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe up to the billions, and then all of the devices that are just spewing DNS lookups continuously.
Well,
one way to think about it is that if you want to get people to malicious resources that you're controlling, which means some kind of server that's doing some kind of dastardly deed for you, there are two ways you can do it. One of them is that you can set up your own domain, your own DNS objects, and hope that you can trick people into coming to those. And then the other way is that you can do what Taylor was describing, which is to intercept traffic that's bound for a legit resource and replace that with the resources that you are controlling. In both cases, you're getting the victims to come to make connections to some sort of resource that you control for whatever reason it is, whether it's credential harvesting or phishing or command and control or what have you. Taylor was describing one of the ways that you can do that, redirecting them or intercepting them, not technically a redirect, but intercepting that traffic and getting it to go to the resources that you're controlling. So cache poisoning, another one, DNS hijacking. So this is one of those things where it's our public service reminder that we do periodically that says, make sure that you are very careful about the credentials that are used to log into your hosting provider, registrar, et cetera, to control your DNS. If you use a weak password there, a guessable password, then if someone malicious can get in there and write new A records, quad A records, name server records, et cetera, for your domain, you're going to have a really bad day. And this does happen sometimes. So that's just one of the many areas where you should use the strongest authentication mechanisms that you can, especially if you're like responsible for an enterprise and not just your like hobby website.
Yeah, from an attack perspective, the second one where, hey, someone's getting in the middle between you and your legitimate bank connection, that is rare. That is really tricky to pull off in 2025, thanks to the magic of certificate transparency logs and browsers doing what they do and all that good stuff. That is a lot trickier to do. So folks now will leverage the lookalikes, right? We've joked about this a little bit, but they'll leverage those homoglyphs or homograt or whatnot. Or it doesn't even have to be particularly even that clever, right? They'll just throw a ton of stuff into the address bar and try and filibuster your brain into thinking that you're at the right spot. That's much more common. Or like Tim said, they've got these giant lists of usernames and passwords, and they're happy to throw it at your registrar, your hosting provider.
So no password 123. No.
Please don't.
As long as you're changing it quarterly to add the summer, spring, fall.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right.
Then you're fine.
No harm can come from that.
You're kidding, everybody. Please don't.
We train some AI.
On the YouTube version, we need like some kind of disclaimer to be flashing up on the screen there.
We could do that. We have the abilities. And I know you said it could probably be its own episode, and we could do that for sure. But just like very briefly, like when you say Kaminsky saved the internet, what do you mean by that?
They discovered that you could essentially, like within a pretty short period, overwrite the name servers for very important things by throwing a ton of stuff at the name server itself and then forcing it to then saying, hey, here's where the resource is, like overflow it. And so they actually work with Microsoft, with the root, the folks that run all the root stuff in the world to get patches in place. And yeah, we did essentially had news of that gone out prior to them being able to patch the way that they did, things would have been a big mess. Have ubiquitous encryption all over the place, right? Like this kind of little, but not by a lot. Like there is HTTPS in 2008, but like the little lockbox thing in your browser is a lot less common, right? That type of attack, the ability to tell folks where the resource you're looking for is actually over here, and just give me your username and password or whatnot, was a lot greater then.
Okay.
It may sound like hyperbole to glibly say the day that Dan Kaminsky saved the internet, but it's not that far off, because as Taylor said, I mean, if this had been exploited at the root level, it would have been a very difficult recovery. It would have caused chaos like we've never seen on the internet, and disruption and all kinds of problems. So it's not really too much of a stretch to put it that way, maybe a little bit, but it was a really big deal. It was one of those things that in retrospect, it was like when you hear about the times that the ICBMs almost got launched by mistake, this is like the internet version of that. Like we came really close to catastrophe and we didn't go over the edge, thank goodness.
Do you think there's potential for something like that to happen again? Or I guess we're speculating, but we do that a lot on the show.
Unknown unknowns.
We won't break it that way again, at least.
Yeah, we didn't know about that one until we did, thanks to Dan.
Very true.
So,
but yeah, we like IPv6 is so broad. Maybe there's some namespace collision stuff there that we haven't thought of.
We can't really know for sure. It seems less likely, I think. And to the point that we have partly made here today and that we make frequently, you don't need to do things the hard way, like finding those holes and exploits and stuff, when there's so much ill-gotten gain to be made by doing stuff the easy way. And threat actors will often just gravitate toward the easy way to do things, which is also often very scalable, and unfortunately get some of those Lambos that they end up showing off on Facebook that ultimately lead to their arrest, which we always like. But in the meantime, there's victims that get defrauded and whatnot, and that's bad.
If you didn't post your Lambo on social media, did you get one? No.
Yeah, did you even get one? They're not posing in front of it in Monaco or something.
Pics or it didn't happen.
You can just deep fake your Lambo now.
Very true. Moving on just a little bit. What did we see in 2024 relating to trends with DNS attacks?
It was still always DNS the whole time. First things first. Yeah.
I am making, for listeners who will be at RSA, I'm going to make some friendship bracelets that say it's always DNS. So look out for those.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of some 1.5 million DNS DDoS attacks in Q1 of 2024. I forget specifically where that stat came from, but that's huge, right? Like they were, if there's 1.5 million of them, they're all, even though they're distributed, they're small-ish. But this is another example. Denial of service is a whole interesting kettle of fish, because that's where there's not necessarily a vulnerability that's exploited. There is just a flooding of legal but illegitimate traffic that winds up drowning the server, essentially.
Every now and then they have to fix hey, wait, you can't ask us questions like that. Like the amplification attacks and the way that they bounce the requests back and forth. And then, it's the denial of service is definitely, that should be its own 40-minute thing. We could get someone and dive in deep on those. I want to learn more about the history of denial of service.
It's an interesting form of attack. And by the way, this happens every year, but we see some report that the largest internet-wide DDoS, which may or may not specifically be against name servers, but there's always some new record with some impressive number of terabits of data flowing from a botnet to create a distributed denial of service attack. And the most recent one that I saw was just a few weeks ago. And it was I don't remember exactly what the volume was, but we see this happen regularly. And I'm frankly surprised that I haven't, and we all conversing at the company and whatnot, have not directly experienced this with outages when those happen. And I'm always thinking, where are they doing this? Because if this is the biggest DDoS to date, and it's this many terabits of DDoS traffic, I must not be visiting very popular sites or something, because I'm not finding resources down when those happen. But going back to keeping it within the DNS world, most of the things that we have observed in recent years have had some part, DNS has played some part in it. And one of the big trends, of course, is we're all thinking about what AI is enabling. And we've seen AI-enabled phishing where the lures are easier to craft. And probably, I'm speculating here because I don't remember if I've seen an article about this, but I suspect that some of the large language models, especially the ones that are better at coding, probably can generate a pretty good fish kit for you as well.
Absolutely, yeah. You could tell them, hey, I want something that looks just like this page, and they will gladly do it. One not new thing, that's something that has picked up the tempo in 24, I'd say, are leveraging of legitimate but like old domains.
Yes.
Infoblox has posted a lot about this. They're the traffic direction systems that they see used by threat actors to deliver malware to victims. where they will compromise legitimate domains and then use them in a relay to serve up malware. And where we've seen that are like old domains where the name servers are delegated to a given name server provider, and maybe you haven't paid the bill at that name server provider, and then someone can just show up and then pay that bill and say, oh, by the way, why don't you point it over here?
Yeah.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we see that with a Martha Stewart sweepstakes?
Yes, the MSN, it was that MSN domain. Yes, it was from the MSN Martha Stewart sweepstakes from like the early 2000s, and the domain had been
Like
sitting around.
2002.
Good memory.
Yeah. And I think that's the footprint in the historical footprint for everyone is just going to get larger. For the large organizations that are multinational, that means that they've got to grapple with that all over the place all the time. And so my guess is we're going to see more of things like that going forward as stuff ages out, as organizations age out and drop domains, or organizations age out and you sign up for a new G Suite account with an old company domain, or you stand up services for old domains and things like that.
Yeah, or companies that have folded too. I think we've talked about that on the show as well, where G Suite information from startups is still accessible.
Yeah. Old resources, old or forgotten resources are a really big attack surface. This is part of the way in which large organizations are understanding their exposure is by looking at their own inventory of assets, which includes domains that they may currently own or may have lapsed, like Taylor's talking about. And we at Domain Tools, we're usually thinking about pointing, our forensic resources on bad guy infrastructure, but it's a really good idea to point them at your own infrastructure as well and understand what all of the domains are that are associated and pivotable to the things that you've got up and running today, and find that domain that you may have forgotten about that's still sitting out there or that's available for registration, and some script may be pointing to it and referring to it. One of the things to be aware of is when we think about DNS, sometimes you'll see somebody talk through the sequence of Alice wants to go to a website, rather, her computer goes and does a DNS resolution of that website's IP address, and then she merrily goes on her way to visit the website. When you visit a modern site and use any kind of internet service, there are dozens to sometimes hundreds of different resources, often at different domains, that are getting looked up as part of bringing that content in. And there are a lot of back-end services that are enabled by different kinds of references and lookups to resources that are not in the URL that you're looking at in your browser's address bar. And those are an attack surface for sure, because sometimes there is delicate information that's traded back and forth in there. And it's very complicated. And there are a lot of these resources to look after. And when we think about an enterprise's footprint in DNS, it's not just their own. It's not just the stuff that they are registering and managing through their authoritative name servers. It's also all the third parties and back-end systems and so forth that are tied together to make things work for them. So it's a very big attack surface, and it's something that, I think teams are paying a lot of attention to, and rightly.
As I'm looking at the time, I want to make sure we're covering what we think might happen in 2025 and beyond with DNS's evolution and resolution. So we talked a little bit about AI crafting domains to flood phishing. What are some mitigations we can do in order to fight what we're seeing with AI?
Some of it I think we've talked about a little bit, which is keeping an eye on the resources that you control and the ways that people get to them, i.e. your DNS space, and watching for things that are imitating you and so forth, so that you can, because those, no matter how well the AI crafts the phishing lure, the victim is still going to connect to some kind of resource, and DNS gets involved there. And the more you can do something about reducing the chances that something is going to successfully point to a resource that's going to imitate you or take advantage of somebody who trusts you and your organization, the better off you're going to be. So the AI crafting of phishing lures is one thing. But again, AI is also going to potentially enable bad actors to just up their game, technically speaking, to look for, I'm going to make things up here, but I don't think it's all that speculative, to look for vulnerabilities, to look for exposed resources that are maybe being unguarded and so forth, and leverage all of that in carrying out a campaign. So it's not as simple, in other words, as just, hey, large language model, craft me up something that's going to pass the social engineering test and that's going to cause the victim to click on this because of what you wrote in the email, or because you made the email look really official, like it came from their bank. It's going to be beyond that, to getting into the actual code behind some of the attacks as well.
Forward thinking from where, I guess all that's great. Like, yeah, I could ditto on all of that. I also think DNS is this kind of large global, you call it a battlefield. It's a global resource. I do wonder how long it remains global, how global it remains. Do we start to see split up of it at all? Not in the foreseeable future. Doesn't look like it's on the horizon, but there are a lot of shifts that are occurring more broadly. And it's hard to think that DNS won't be impacted by those in some way, shape, or form. We've seen shifts over to RDAP over the last couple of months. So there's some modernization of the underpinning things that help support the domain name system and the kind of industry that is around it and allows it to remain that kind of global backbone for connecting resources.
So big picture, would you say DNS is both a target and a tool, but it provides that intelligence, provides the edge in threat hunting?
It's one of the Achilles heels of any kind of malicious actor, that they almost always will have to use resources that leave some kind of breadcrumbs behind in the record, whether it's the passive DNS record, WHOIS records, etc. There are some, if they manage to walk into a physical office with a USB drive and connect that and start doing bad things in there, okay, the internet doesn't come into play, DNS doesn't come into play necessarily there. But most of the kinds of malicious activities that occur online do leave some traces behind. Some of them are easier to follow than others, but there's almost always something there. And so from a forensic perspective and a protective perspective, there are always going to be options available to you in the DNS and DNS adjacent space. So that's one of the things that has been really interesting in this business, is as we see attack types come and go and what's popular and what people are falling for as victims and so forth, DNS is a common denominator across all of it.
For sure. Taylor, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think not only external DNS, but your internal DNS is really interesting as well. What resources are getting asked about on your network are getting answered about. There's metadata there behind those from a threat hunting perspective that can be really interesting. And it's where the adversaries are, right? We see Black Bastard cheat, like the chat logs get leaked, and they've got their members are registering domains as their kind of monikers online. They're registering domains for their forums. There's C2 activity, phishing activity, all kinds of stuff there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Once an attacker gets a foothold inside a network, and a lot of times we hear about attacks where some of the credentials stolen are Windows domain controller administration credentials. If you own the Windows domain controller, then again, just kind of like with the internet, you can point everything that uses that domain controller inside the Windows environment, which can be many thousands of devices with the highest privileges, you can point them to resources you are controlling. So again, that becomes a really big deal within that environment. So Taylor's 100% right.
Think of all the Rickrolls you could do.
Yeah, if that's the worst that you do, that's good. That'd be a good thing for red teams to do, is basically wherever they find something exposed to put some form or another of a Rickroll in there. Some of them probably do that already, and my hat is off to them.
Hopping calculator. We want to see.
I would love to see more, Rick, for sure. Yeah, I think we are just at about time to talk about DNS, and we have takeaways too. There's other elements of our DNS masterclass we could share in subsequent episodes, which I think will be great. But Tim and Taylor, is there anything you want to leave our audience with before we adjourn?
It's always DNS. Is that cheating? That's cheating to say that, isn't it?
But it's so true. It's a cliche.
I mean, actually, behind that is the sentiment of really think about what DNS can do for you from a forensic perspective and a protective perspective. There's a lot there. There's quite a bit of promise. Now, that's work, but it's work that I think can really pay off.
Tay, anything, or you feel resolute?
I think we've resolved everything. I think we're good.
Good. Perfect. All right. Wow. This has been our first episode in what I think could be a very intriguing series of our DNS Masterclass. So stay tuned for more of those in the future. If you have any questions or ideas, please leave them in the comments below. We'd love to get more of your perspective on what you could use help with, what you're seeing, and you'd like some more insight on. We'd love to answer those questions. So thank you, Tim and Taylor, for your wonderful insights today. Thank you to our audience for listening as always, and catch us again next week for another all-new episode of Breaking Badness. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, y'all.
That's about all we have for this week. You can find us on Twitter @DomainTools. All of the articles mentioned today will be included in our blog post, which can be found at blog.domaintools.com. Catch us every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time when we publish our podcast and blog. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Breaking Badness. Until then, remember, don't drink and click.